Like the Chilean miners emerging from the depths, I have returned from my exile in Wales. I'm back in England, basically exclusively so I can get the COVID jab. It's been like, I think 470 odd days. That's how the UK's rollout is going. Anyways, imagine, if you will, a dimension of traffic cones, because today that's what we're gonna do. So here we've got our scene, and up here we have our outliner. I haven't spoken about the outliner much, and that's because, generally speaking, the more visually important parts of Blender happen here, but the outliner is, I think, equally important, because the outliner is where you keep charge of your taxonomy. Well, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new collection, and I'm just going to say that it is just for cones. I only want cones to be in this selection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the cone, I'm going to grab the outside stripe and the inside stripe, and I'm going to press M for move to move it to a new collection. I'm going to call it cones in all caps because I'm very upset about this. I'm also going to right click inside of the outliner and make a new collection this way, because you can do that both ways if you want, whichever one you find is most appealing. New collection, I'm going to double click it to rename it, and I'm going to call it ground, and then I'm going to move the plane in there. And then for this collection, since it's got my camera, my irradiance volume, and my light, I'm just going to press F2 to rename it, and I'm going to rename it camera stuff. So cool, we've got our collections, and they're all nice and organized. I want to make multiple traffic cones, or like multiple versions of this traffic cone, because frankly, if we had the dimension and all of the cones looked identical, it would be kind of boring and not quite as visually interesting. Nothing in the real world looks completely identical. Let's see, I've got these two packages of sugar-free gum on my desk, right? But there are micro differences. Like, for instance, on this one, there's a little bit more wear, like on the front. You can't see it because, you know, it's tiny. Than on this one, and so on and so forth. And also this one's still got the wrapping on it because I'm almost done with this tin, but, you know, I wanted to make sure I had a backup. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this cone so that I can make sure that happens. So the first thing to do, obviously, is to grab both your cone and your stripe and press Shift D, and then just move that over into the backup, just so that you can keep a version of it if you're not comfortable making duplicates of this, because what we are going to do is going to be pretty destructive. I am going to take the cone and the stripe, and I'm going to press Ctrl J for join. And all of a sudden, those two aren't two separate objects. Previously, we had the stripe as its own thing that was just parented to the cone, but now they are the same. So I can pick up the cone and I can move it around if I'm so inclined, and I might be inclined to do so, as you'll soon see. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I am going to make the base of the cone actually like the ground, because what we're seeing right now, this like dot that we're seeing in the middle of the cone is it's what it's called its origin. And I don't want the origin to be here, because what happens is like it rotates around there, and while that might be useful in some instances, it won't be useful in the instance that we're doing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit numpad 1 so I can see the ground, and then I am going to move the center of the cone. So the center of the cone right now is the 3D cursor. It's like that by default. So if yours isn't, just move it on over to where the 3D cursor is, and then I'm going to press F3 and I'm going to say origin to 3D cursor. And all of a sudden, now our origin is the 3D cursor, which means that if I were to move this around, it would be spinning on the 3D cursor, which is exactly what I want. It pivots from the where it would realistically pivot on the origin. So the next thing that I'm going to do to make sure that I have multiple cones to play with is I'm going to save, and then I'm going to press Shift D just like 3 or 4 times, so that I have like a few different versions of this traffic cone. I'm going to hide this regular version, and then I'm going to kind of space out these other versions a little bit. Maybe I'll press 1 and I'll just like drag this one off to the side, and drag this one off to the side, drag this one off to the side, so that we've got like our 4 bespoke unique versions of the traffic cone. I'll take this one off to the side as well. And then we've got the old one in the middle. I don't want to touch this one, because I think that this one is going to be important. I really like the work that we've put into this one, and I don't want that work to like go poorly in case like something bad happens. So I've got these lovely traffic cones. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to work on making them slightly different. I'm also going to turn off the irradiance volume because I keep accidentally selecting points on that. So that's something. Just, Spencer, you did this joke last time. It's not a joke. I found White Claw in the UK. I've never seen it here before, and I thought diplomatic immunity, or himblomatic immunity, I guess, because I am a himbo. So, cool, we've got our traffic cones. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to use proportional editing to just kind of like smush them around. I'm gonna make my like cursor really big, and I'm just gonna like go through and I'm gonna like drag pieces of the cone around, back up, just to deform the geometry and make it look a little bit different from the last cone that we did. So I want different kind of lumpy looking, interesting cones in my scene. And once I have like a few that look different enough without like being ridiculous, what I can do is I can take those and I can turn them into what is called a particle system. But I'll get more into that later. In the meantime, I'm just gonna deform these cones, make them all lumpy, and I'm really excited to get my vaccine later today. I've been like waiting for it for what feels like a year, but like genuinely, I don't know. I know that our long international nightmare isn't over because like there are still quite a few developing countries that don't have access to it yet or proper refrigeration techniques. But what can I say? I'm very selfish, and I'm happy that I can finally go outside and start learning to be like a real human again. Remember that you can use either your mouse button to lock it to an axis or Y, X, and Z to make sure, accidentally did that, to push it in like a specific direction. Those controls are really important, especially if you're doing something like a character model where you're exclusively editing in like certain viewports, and you need to make sure that it doesn't like kind of go out in a weird direction, because if you're looking at something from a 3D camera in like a specific direction, what often happens is you could move it to like what seems to be your left, but then like you go down and it's like, oh, I accidentally moved it down as well. So it is just very, very useful and very handy to have those different shortcuts on hand. There we go. Those, now we have like a collection of vaguely different lumpy looking traffic cones. I guess in this world we've just kind of got like a bunch of traffic cones that are being knocked over a lot. No laws when you're drinking claws. So cool, we've got our traffic cones. Now what do we do? Well, if your computer is like a little bit on the weaker end, you might have noticed that there has been like a little bit of performance issues. So this is because as far as traffic cones go, all of these are pretty high poly. I think for the most part, if you ever find like a traffic cone in a video game or you ever see one in like a movie, it'll literally just be like a cone that's like far away enough that you can't tell that it's like a little bit weird. But these are like really high end, like we've put a lot of work into modeling them, and they look good in, you know, the modeling form, and just in general, these are what we would call like hero props. These are props that would like be in front of the camera or be really visible, so there has to be a lot of detail put into them. But we're making a dimension full of traffic cones, and frankly, it would not make any sense to like have a dimension full of really well done traffic cones, because first of all, people won't notice the difference, and second of all, your computer is going to be so upset because any resolution you have here is going to be multiplied like 1,000 times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these cones and I'm going to add in a modifier called decimate. And what the decimate modifier does is it will kind of take the subdivisions that we've done, which are, you know, like all of these, and it'll just kind of unsubdivide it. So like for instance, if I switch over to unsubdivide, you can see that like, oh, okay, procedurally we're getting fewer and fewer. But this isn't quite the operation that we want, because you can see it does some really weird stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to collapse, and I'm going to set the ratio to something that's like really low. So I'm going to apply the same decimate modifier to all of these. I'm going to take the ratio and say 0.16 and just keep doing that for all of the traffic cones except for my hero one, because my hero one is special and I don't want it to get decimated. Generally speaking, the fact that there are models that will just be lower poly than others is a really important thing in 3D animation and stuff in general. We can't have everything have this like absurd level of detail that the, you know, important one is going to have. Stuff in the background needs to not be as good, because then it frees up time to work on the important things. There's a really good anecdote that Mark Hamill once told about the garbage compactor scene. His hair is wet in that scene, and then in the next scene, which they filmed a couple of days later, his hair is dry. And he was like freaking out about the continuity over this, and then like Harrison Ford, in his cavalier way, pulls him aside and says, "Hey kid, it ain't that kind of movie. If people are looking at your hair, we're all in big trouble." And that's kind of the deal. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new collection that's just for my hero cone, and I'm going to leave my other cones in the other one. So I'm going to select the hero cone, I'm going to press M, move to new collection, and I'm just going to call this one hero cone. Now we've got all of these low poly cones that we're comfortable just dragging around, and we could, if we wanted to, fill the world by just, you know, taking these and multiplying them and, like, you know, rotating them a little bit. And you might have to do that to a certain extent at a later step, but there is actually a far easier way. I'm just going to select these and press X to delete. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the plane, which is the ground here, and I am going to go down here to particle properties and press plus. And by default, we get this like weird one where if I press play, we get these balls dropping from it. And that's because this is an emitter particle. There are two main kinds of particle systems in Blender. There's emitter and there's hair. And the one that works by default is emitter. It's pretty useful for if you want things that are like flowing out. You get these balls, they're called halos. And they just kind of look like that, but you can set it to like an object. So if we want, we could just make this. Here, let me go down to render, and I'm going to say render as object, and then I'm going to make the instance object one of these traffic cones, and you can see it is raining tiny traffic cones. If I bring up the scale, it's like, oh. So there's that, and that's pretty good, but it's not what we're looking for, because we want the particles to be a little bit more permanent. We don't want them to be falling like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch it to hair, and whoa, that's weird. All of a sudden, by default, it has switched it to traffic cones. But generally speaking, if you just set it to render as nothing, it will render as this, which, you know, we get a lot of hair sticking out. Immediately, I'm going to set it to like 60 hair, just so that I don't have to, you know, worry about having a large number of traffic cones in my scene, because like if we're going to be rendering each one of these hairs as an object, it's going to be a little bit intensive, especially if you have a lower end computer. What I am going to do is I am going to say I want each one of these hairs to be a traffic cone, and to do that I am going to go down here to render this tab, and I'm going to say render as collection, and I'm going to set the instance collection to be cones in all caps, and now you can see all of our cones are on this area, but they don't necessarily look that great. Sure, they're, you know, here, but they're a little bit big, they're all skewed on their side. How can we go about fixing this? Well, there are a couple of ways. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to pick random. I'm also going to pick object rotation, because that's going to be useful in the future when we turn these on their side. And then the last thing that I am going to do, I'm going to go into use count, which if you don't pick random is basically the ratio of how many cones you want. Say like for each, you know, 4 of these cones, I actually want 2 of traffic cone 3 or something like that. So that's something that's like pretty useful if you're trying to render like a nature scene and you want a whole bunch of grass but not too many weeds. You could go into the use count and do it that way. But I'm just going to disable that and go into pick random. The other thing that I want to do, I'm going to tick advanced here. And I know what you're thinking, we're not advanced. This is literally like episode 6 of a software tutorial. But I promise you, we're advanced enough for this. I'm going to go down here to rotation, which was previously not there but is there now. And I am going to randomize the phase a little bit. So I'm just going to set it like this and randomize the phase. So now our traffic cones are all pointing in different directions as opposed to pointing in the same direction. The final thing that I want to do is go to the actual cone objects themselves and rotate them, because that is how you get these traffic cones to rotate and stay on their side. So if I go into viewport 1 and I rotate the cones like this, all of a sudden they are all standing upright. So I can see that. But these cones are also kind of weird. They're positioned very poorly. So if we were to go into our camera, we would be able to see that, like, oh, that's weird, there are cones like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm also just going to drag them down so that the camera doesn't have to see them. So great, we've got ourselves a particle system full of traffic cones. If you want to mess with other things, you can change around the phase, you can change around the randomness, you can change the scale, which I think is very good, and the scale randomness, which I also think is very good, especially if you're doing a particle for something naturey. Say that you want your cones to be concentrated in a specific area, because let's face it, a particle system is like, it's not like cheap chips on your computer. It's you are going to presumably want to cluster your particles in a place where the camera can actually see them, because right now there are like all of 4 particles I think that the camera can see, and a whole bunch that the camera can't. So say that I only want traffic cones to spawn, that's what I'm going to say, spawn within like this region. What you can do is something called weight painting. Now it's pretty easy to get into weight painting, but we won't be able to do it immediately, and I'll show you why. First of all, you press Control Tab to head over to Weight Paint. And Weight Paint is a nice workspace where everything becomes predator vision. And the reason for that is because basically you're establishing how the values are of something are distributed across a plane. So for instance, blue is 0, and if I click on this corner, we can see that like it starts to go to 1, which is red, and so we get this like kind of scale. But unfortunately, if you click basically anywhere else, we're not really getting anything. It's only when you go to the corners that all of a sudden you start getting like results. So the reason for that is this plane doesn't really have any geometry. Like sure, it's got those 4 corners, but that's only 4 corners, and we've seen how many vertices our traffic cones have. Like that's way more than that. So what you do is you head into edit mode and you just kind of right click subdivide a couple of times. Usually like this many will do it. And now all of a sudden I can start painting on this. It's still like a little rough, so maybe I'll go and I'll subdivide it one more time, and there you go. Now I've got like a nicer sort of thing. And I can say, all right, this part, you know, maybe I want this part exclusively to be big. And the same controls that work with sculpting will work here as well. If you press F, you can embiggen your brush, and if you press F, you can ensmallen it, and you can go up here to say what weight you want to paint. Maybe all of this is red, but hey, you actually want this part to be blue. That's something you can do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the camera view, and I'm going to expand this window, and I'm just only going to paint what I can see in the camera view. Because like, sure, there are reasons to paint in other places, like if you want the reflections and the light bounces to be like a little bit more accurate, I can see making a case for painting behind the camera, but honestly, I don't want to do that. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to paint around like the outline of what the camera can see, and then I'm going to fill it in later with this brush so that we get a kind of nice full sort of spectrum of it. So that's basically what weight painting is. You are saying what parts of the mesh belong to what vertex group. A vertex group being just like this. If I were to go into weight painting and I create a new group, you can see that I have a new group now, and I can switch between the two of them if I'm so inclined. You can add as many vertex groups as you want for one mesh. A lot of meshes have like a bunch of them, especially if you're doing, my Warrior Cats rig has like, I think 500 or something, because it just does. And it's really important to be able to tell the mesh like, hey, this is the area that's the paw, so when we move the paw thing, you know, only move that area, don't move anything else. So weight painting is really, really useful for this kind of thing. So once you're happy with the area that you want the cones to be in, you can go to the particle settings, scroll down here to vertex groups, and assign the density to group. And there you go. All of a sudden the cones are only going to start spawning in this area, and you can turn the number up and you can turn the number down, and do whatever you want until you're happy with the amount of cones and stuff that you have. So neat, we've got our cones. I think the very last thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to hide my crimes a little bit, because frankly this does not look that great for the cones. There are a lot of places, and this is just kind of a comorbidity with how how particles work. There are a lot of places where they overlap, or there are too many cones in one area. And while I'm not worried about like fixing all of them, I am worried about fixing the ones that I know the cameras can see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of the traffic cones, and I'm just going to duplicate it a little bit, and then I'm going to drag it into, I'd say, camera stuff, but maybe I'll make a new collection that just says hiding my crimes. And this will be where I just put traffic cones that I'm going to use to hide crimes, because that's what's important to me, hiding crimes. So I'm going to drag it up, and I'm going to bring it on over to where the camera can see it, and I'm just going to kind of like rotate it and shift it a little bit so that it will sort of cover up this area, which is a little bit unsightly. There are like 4 cones clipping into each other, and I don't want people to see that. I truly don't. I think it would be suck. I think that would sucks for me. So yeah, something like that. And there you go. Now that's a little bit more difficult to see. And you can do the same thing as many times as you want. I mean, maybe I'll create another, and I'll take it over here to where, there are some other things. And I'm only going to do this in the regions that the camera can see. The reason for that being that I do not think that I should have to cover everything. I'm going to make this cone like a little bit smaller. Maybe they use this cone for like a kid's soccer game or football game if you're Ted Lasso. Go. Now that's done. Maybe I'll have to cover up some more in this corner, but really this is up to your personal taste. You can also just do this to add some variance so the cones aren't sticking straight up and down. You've got a few cones in your scene that are just like a little bit kind of tilted, maybe a little bit silly. You know how it is. Make it interesting. I trust you. I really do. So cool. We've got something like that. So the last thing that I'm going to say before I move on is, first of all, save. So it should be noted that using a particle system for this kind of thing is sort of considered old hat, and you can now do this with a system called geometry nodes. However, geometry nodes are a little bit more advanced than this tutorial is ready for, and a lot of other tutorials for things like adding foliage and grass to scenes will use this method. So it's good that you get like a little bit of practice with this. Especially if you are interested in pursuing other tutorials after this. In Blender, there's more than one way to skin a cat in basically every situation, and it's honestly more advantageous for you to learn as many of those ways as possible. Anyway, bye now.